Russia and Ukraine have been locked in a grueling war for more than 3 years now, with both sides struggling to achieve any significant breakthrough on the ground. Recently, a flurry of US-led diplomatic efforts has aimed to halt the fighting and secure a lasting peace. President Trump has been outspoken about delivering swift results, even claiming a deal is within reach. Yet, despite this intense pressure, negotiations appear stalled, and progress remains elusive, as confirmed by the recent talks in Istanbul. So, why is peace so difficult to achieve in Ukraine, and how likely is the situation to shift in the future? To understand why peace in Ukraine is so hard to achieve, we first need to understand what each side wants. Let's start with Russia. Russia firmly believes now that it holds the upper hand and can dictate the terms of the peace. Indeed, after its initial plan to quickly overrun Ukraine failed, Russia adapted to the war's attritional nature, making slow but steady gains along the front line, while bolstering its forces through an aggressive recruitment campaign. Besides, Western sanctions have largely failed to cripple Russia's economy, and many Western nations have now depleted their stockpiles of weapons, limiting their ability to continue arming Ukraine in the long run. Thus, from Moscow's perspective, there is little pressure to compromise or rush into peace. Nevertheless, that does not mean that Russia is opposed to negotiations. On the contrary, it has maintained an open stance since the beginning of the conflict, and an agreement was nearly reached in Istanbul in 2022. Since then, Russia's core demands remained the same and include: first, the so-called denazification of Ukraine, which involves banning what Russia labels as radical elements within the Ukrainian society, and ending alleged persecution of Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Then the demilitarization of Ukraine, meaning the imposition of strict limits on the size and the weaponry of Ukraine's armed forces. And finally, the neutralization of Ukraine, ensuring the country never joins NATO. These core demands are still Russia's priority, though it has now additional territorial claims. Russia has annexed parts of 4 Ukrainian regions: Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk, in addition to Crimea, and insists that this new ground reality be recognized in any deal. In fact, it has emerged in recent days that Russia claims not just the parts of those regions that it directly controls, but their whole administrative territories. This maximalist stance is of course far from being acceptable to Ukraine. However, it has to be said that Russia's willingness to sit at the negotiation table is at least in part self-serving posturing, signaling to allies like China and India and the broader international community that Russia is a responsible, reasonable power, not an erratic aggressor. Yet, Russia's unwillingness to compromise remains, as shown during the recent talks in Istanbul, and its refusal of a lengthy unconditional ceasefire is notable, as it sees it as a chance for Ukraine to regroup and rearm, halting Russian momentum on the front. Finally, it's worth noting that Russia's seemingly reasonable stance on negotiations is not universally supported domestically. Many hardline hawks push for continuing the war until Ukraine's unconditional surrender, with some even demanding additional territory, such as the strategic port of Odessa. Meanwhile, Ukraine's perspective starkly contrasts with Russia's. Even though Ukraine was close to an agreement that leaned toward Russia's terms in 2022, it has since firmly rejected Moscow's demands. Ukraine views denazification as a baseless pretext for Russia's invasion, and demilitarization and neutralization as direct threats to its sovereignty, potentially paving the way for future Russian aggression. Territorial concessions are also non-negotiable, with Ukrainian authorities arguing that ceding land would violate the constitution. In reality, Ukraine's priority is securing a prolonged ceasefire before any peace talks. A ceasefire would give Ukraine's battered forces a chance to regroup, rearm and recover from the relentless attrition. Peace negotiations, on the other hand, are daunting as they would likely require compromises, especially on territory that Ukraine is unwilling to make. A ceasefire, by contrast, demands no immediate concessions. However, Ukraine's insistence on retaining its full territory and securing robust security guarantees creates a deadlock. Ukraine sees Western-backed security assurances as essential to counter Russian aggression, but these clash with Russia's demands for demilitarization and neutrality. For Moscow, Western military support, such as deploying European troops via a coalition of the willing or formal defense pacts, would effectively equate to NATO membership, a red line for the Russian authorities. To sum up, Russia and Ukraine's demands are fundamentally at odds. Russia pushes for peace talks without a ceasefire, while Ukraine insists on an unconditional ceasefire first. Russia, confident in its battlefield gains, refuses to budge on its core demands, but Ukraine rejects concessions that would undermine its sovereignty. Territorial concessions demanded by Russia are unacceptable to Ukraine, and Ukraine's need for Western security guarantees conflicts with Russia's opposition to any NATO-like arrangement. But the problem goes beyond simply having clashing demands and requirements for peace. Indeed, the problem, at least for Ukraine, is that peace in itself might present the current ruling elite with challenges that could be even more dangerous than the current state of war. First, from an economic point of view, many questions are raised about the future of Ukraine. At first glance, the Ukrainian economy seems healthy enough as there is growth in recent years and the currency is stable. However, this is essentially a mirage, as in reality the Ukrainian economy is only avoiding complete collapse thanks to Western aid that is accounting for up to 40% of the country's GDP. Peace could then jeopardize this lifeline, especially as the European economies, grappling with their own economic crisis, may struggle to justify sustained aid in peacetime. Proposals to seize frozen Russian assets for reconstruction are gaining traction, but face legal and political hurdles. Meanwhile, unpaid loans loom large. Would they be forgiven? Long-term recovery looks bleak, with industries in ruins, millions of refugees unlikely to return, a collapsing birth rate, and many prime-age workers lost to the war. But it is politically that the situation is really explosive. The war has allowed President Zelensky's government to consolidate power under martial law, suspending election and silencing dissent. Peace would likely mean the end of martial law, forcing elections that could threaten the regime's survival. Zelensky's popularity is hard to gauge, but several factors undermine his position. Forced conscription is deeply unpopular, corruption remains rampant, political opponents face censorship or imprisonment, and radical groups oppose any peace deal. Most critically, the public may demand answers for why Ukraine rejected more favorable peace terms in 2022. Peace could thus spark division and unrest and could spell the doom of Zelensky himself. Hence, Ukraine finds itself in zugzwang. Continuing the war is unsustainable on the long term due to the crippling attrition, with frontline losses mounting. But at the same time, peace represents a risk of economic and political upheaval. For the regime, the least bad option may thus be a prolonged ceasefire without a formal peace deal. This would pause the fighting, allowing Ukraine to regroup while maintaining martial law without the imperative of elections, and would also keep Western aid flowing. However, with Russia gaining momentum on the ground, there is little chance to see an unconditional ceasefire implemented. Overall, the chance of a negotiated peace appears slim, and for the moment everything points to the continuation of the fighting to the bitter end.